Arcades. Do you remember them? I remember arcades. I grew up in an arcade. Well, not actually in an arcade, but in an arcade town. So I spent a lot of my youth in arcades. One of my earliest arcade experiences was seeing this crazy looking side-scrolling shooter. It was gory, it was action-packed, it had horrible alien designs and graphics that were really impressive for the time, and, needless to say, as a small child my eyes were glued to it. We are of course talking about R-Type, but what is R-Type? I'm glad you asked. Allow me to elaborate. But first, hello, I'm Paul Johnson. I made this film. How did I make it? What were the reasons behind me making it? What were my motivations? Well, let's get into all of them in this, the behind-the-scenes documentary of the making of the documentary of the making of the behind-the-scenes of the R-Type short film. To begin with, what is R-Type? R-Type is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up released in the arcades in 1987 by Irem Software Engineering. And if that name rings a bell, they were actually known for other arcade classics such as Moon Patrol, Kung Fu Master, which a lot of people owned on the NES actually. It was one of the earliest beat-em-ups ever made, as well as the seminal submarine shoot-em-up In the Hunt, which, if it looks familiar, look at this, do the graphics look familiar? Does the animation look familiar? This was actually made by a team of Irem programmers who later go on their own way. They changed the name to Nazca and they would create the famous Metal Slug franchise. But anyway, R-Type. R-Type was, especially for 1987 when it was released, this was visually striking with some magnificent designs and impressive bosses. The Bido Empire that you're fighting, they look like a disturbing fusion of mechanical parts and HR Giga paintings, married into a horrific nightmare. When I was a kid in the arcades, I'd never seen anything like it, let me tell you. I still remember the brains in jars and the aliens leaping out from piles of weird corpses. It might not look like it now, but at the time this was pretty mind-blowing in the late 80s. For instance, the second level is made up entirely of a giant battleship that's about 3 screens long, which was impressive game design for the time, let me tell you. Add to that an insane difficulty level that was all about dying over and over and over again until you'd memorized every single enemy attack pattern, and R-Type ended up as an arcade hit that all the home console and computer owners of the time wanted on their home systems, and I was one of them. Luckily, pretty much every home platform got a version of R-Type, so even if you weren't there to play it in the arcades, you might have run into it in some form or another. My version of choice was this, the Sega Master System version. The 8-bit machines couldn't really handle those arcade graphics, but the Commodore 64 version had fantastic music. Really, really fantastic music. Listen to this. Needless to say, the success of the original R-Type spawned an entire series. There was R-Type 2 for the arcades, followed by Gallop or Cosmic Cop if you're in America. There was R-Type Leo.
Let's go.
And then onto home consoles for R-Type 3 on the Super Nintendo. R-Type Delta on the PlayStation. And then the last game in the main series, R-Type Final on the PlayStation 2 in 2003. After that, there were 2 turn-based strategy games for the PSP called R-Type Tactics and R-Type Tactics 2 Operation Bitter Chocolate. R-Type Final and these two strategy games really expand the story of the R-Type universe and up the cosmic horror factor, showing how humanity created the Bido as bioweapons in the future, who then went out of control, travel back in time, assimilating everything they come across in the style of John Carpenter's The Thing because they just want to go home to Earth. Yeah, R-Type is basically a big tragedy, closed time loop paradox thing, and most of the aliens that you've been killing in the games are actually your pilots, who often don't even know what they've been turned into and just want to go home. But enough of that, what about the R-Type short film? How did that come about? In 2016, I was contacted by Tom from the Channel 4 YouTube channel Mashed. He'd seen my TIE Fighter film, which I'd worked on earlier, and he wanted to work with me on something game related, so we had a bit of a brainstorm and we ended up settling on R-Type. The idea was to take a level from R-Type and animate it like a full-on space battle from a classic anime such as Macross Do You Remember Love or Project A-ko or Megazone 2-3, that kind of thing. R-Type was released in 1987, so doing it in a late 80s anime style just kind of made sense. Tom produced the thing, I drew and animated it, and for music I roped in Zach Rahman, the long-suffering Zach Rahman, who'd previously done the music for TIE Fighter, if you remember, and he provided a glorious remix of the R-Type Stage 1 music and the famous boss theme as well. Also, we got Joey Leva back again from TIE Fighter to provide sound effects and sound mixing. The reason we chose R-Type is that the levels in R-Type are quite iconic and attention-grabbing graphics-wise. You know, you see them and you remember them, and a lot of people remember them to this day. The first stage especially, and its end boss, is still remembered by people today, so I was interested in basically the opportunity to take what was a flat environment and characters that we'd only ever seen from the side and faithfully recreate them in quote-unquote real space, where we could have the camera panning cinematically around the battle and see these famous ships and enemies from you know, all angles basically. I'd have to imagine what they looked like from the front, the back, the top, etc., and this was an intriguing art challenge. Anyway, after a few months of work, the 3-minute film was released on the Mashed channel. Due to time constraints, I'd had to cut out some enemies and the animation quality on the human characters wasn't quite good enough. So before releasing it myself on my own channel, I figured I'd do a bit of cleanup, do a bit of extra work, add in some more scenes, you know, overall clean up the animation. And the end result is currently what you see on my YouTube channel. It's a remastered director's cut, if you will. So, how do you take a 2D arcade shoot-'em-up and turn it into an animated feature? That's what I wanted to know, so I had a look at those who'd gone before, in an attempt to do a bit of research. I was in luck, because in 1986, Konami released Salamander in the arcades, and it got an anime adaptation. Salamander also has quite an iconic first level, just like R-Type. It had teeth coming out of the walls, it ended in a pulsating brain as a boss that you have to fight at the end of the level. It had a real organic feel to it, a bit like R-Type. So I watched the anime and I was looking forward to seeing how the anime would portray the various terrain and enemy encounters of the level. The anime had a pedigree behind it. It even had character art by Haruhiko Mikomoto, my favourite character designer, so I was looking forward to this. You know, surely, they do a really good job of animating the level boss at least. So let's have a look.
これよ。
やるぞ。
And there you go. That's it. The anime was mostly talking and they hardly showed any locations from the game at all, so not especially helpful on the whole. Not especially helpful. I knew that I had to adapt the first stage of R-Type into an animated film. Most of it would be centered around the iconic R9 Arrowhead fighter that you fly in the first R-Type game, so my first job was to grab all the reference material that I could and settle on a nice authentic design for the ship. Which included, you know, technical things like the cockpit, what the dashboard looked like inside, what the seat looked like, all of that kind of thing. This was initially very tricky because all the posters and box art and whatnot from the time had completely different looking ships. You know, these posters were all drawn by different people and there wasn't much oversight between companies drawing them. I mean, look at some of these. This is nice. This is a really nice picture, but it is not the R9 fighter from R-Type. I'm actually really partial to the Master System cover as well. And again, it's a really nice picture, but it's not right. It's not right. Luckily, Japanese guides and databooks have been released since, as well as, you know, model kits and the like. So I used a mix of the model kit cockpit and the dashboard from the R-Type 3 game on the Super Nintendo. I just kind of bashed them together. For the exterior of the ship, I was actually in luck because 3D models of the ship were made for later games like R-Type Tactics and Delta, so I could just boot those up and have a look at the ship from any angle I liked. So yeah, I grabbed as many reference screenshots as I could and made a crude 3D model of the ship in Cinema 4D, which would basically allow me to place cameras in the cockpit, cameras around the ship, set up my shots and ensure that everything stayed on model. Incidentally, the HUD that you see inside the cockpit here,
I literally can't see shit. Oh, okay, good.
that's actually a homage to a little R-Type minigame that used to be on the PlayStation Home back in 2010. Here it is, look. It's gone now, so enjoy this footage. Moving on, I then used the exact same technique to grab references for the rest of the enemies from the first level of R-Type and make rough 3D models of them, or just draw them. Ones that I couldn't find models for, such as this insect here, I just interpreted them using my imagination. Also, the green and red mech-type enemies, as well as the white-coloured cancer units, were later reused in 3D R-Type games like R-Type Tactics. So, you know, I did have 3D models to go off, but their look had changed quite a lot. They'd really changed the look of them, so I just kind of scrapped those and went with my imagination. I looked at what they looked like in the original R-Type game and kind of extrapolated that side view into a full-on, you know, 3D illustration. Also, I really wanted to keep the body horror and the organic aspect of the original game and show some alien guts and bones and whatnot inside them. We never saw the inside of these little red ships, for instance, but I figured that they'd probably be dead or corrupted human pilots inside there, so I drew them that way. I also wanted to do a lot of crazy camera movement, so the easiest way to block out my scenes was just to bite the bullet basically and make a 3D model of the whole first level from R-Type. I'm not a 3D animator, as you might know, I'm a 2D guy, but luckily I'd be using this only for reference and hand drawing in the details, the explosions, the bullets, the glow effects. I'd be drawing all of those in by hand, so the model really only had to be extremely rough. I don't know how to do things like explosions and particle effects in 3D, but it didn't matter because I would be hand drawing those. So in Cinema 4D I would make the models of the ships, the enemies, the background, the environment, and using the sketch and toon filter I could render my rough 3D models out as black and white lines and then hand color and detail them in TV Paint, which is my animation software of choice. In the short film the main character is just some random guy in an arcade, so I would render out the ship with an empty cockpit and then draw the pilot in by hand, matching him to the movement of the ship. Tricky, time consuming, but it ended up working out quite well, I think. So what did these look like? I will show you. Shots would start out looking like this hilariously bad kind of 3D mess, like this. Then they would turn into black and white lines, and then I would hand color them and add in a bunch of details, explosions, glows, and airbrush effects by hand. The shots in the arcade at the beginning and the end of the film were just traditional 2D animation in TV Paint on top of backgrounds that I painted in Photoshop. For the design of the guy, I referenced old 80s fashion magazines, and this dude's hair is essentially just Billy Idol's hair from around 1984.
Maybe it works on other games in here.
The arcade that it's all taking place in, that was fun because it gave me the chance to basically design my own dream arcade. So I kind of went with an old mansion that's been converted into a kind of retro gaming museum / arcade thing. You can't really tell in the film because the backgrounds are on the screen for only a few seconds each, but yeah, I've added a lot of Easter eggs and details in there. As you can see, there are some black areas in some of these that I didn't paint in because they would be covered up by the characters standing in front of them. And that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this brief look into the production process and the way that I go about doing things. As you have no doubt noticed by now, this film in particular really was a mix of very rough 3D and hand-drawn 2D, with most of the time actually being taken up by colouring and shading. Thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of colouring and shading. Thank you for supporting me as always and allowing me to keep colouring and shading for thousands and thousands of hours. I simply could not do it without you extremely generous folks over on Patreon, so thank you. Thank you for inserting your coins. And with that, I shall bid you farewell. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll see you again. Cheerio for now.